Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and I live in a very windy but very beautiful part of the country. Today, what I want to talk about is something that has been asked about quite a bit over the years, which is, or actually, usually the way that it comes up is not really a question, but more like a kind of odd accusation that I ignore a kind of quote unquote obvious source for the runes used by speakers of early Germanic languages like Old Norse, Old English, and as far back as their ancestor language, Proto-Germanic, and that this supposedly obvious source is the so-called Turkic runes. Now, there's a bunch of terms that we need to define here, and I also need to kind of define what I mean by saying these aren't connected and what I don't mean. So first of all, to define the terms, the runic alphabets, the runes used in Northern Europe. We have our earliest evidence, perhaps from as early as 50 BC, if radiocarbon dating of the Sphingers stones fragments are correct. And then there are the Turkic runes, also called Orkhon, which are not known from that early. And these are used largely in, when I say Turkic, it might make you think about Turkey, but really talking about a much earlier period when Turkic-speaking people are largely much further east. There's still a lot of Turkic-speaking groups much further east, but we're talking about Turkic-speaking people in eastern Siberia, Mongolia, a little bit into northwestern areas of what's China today. And we're talking about many, many centuries earlier. We're talking, or later, excuse me. We're talking about, let me just make sure I didn't write this down wrong, around the 700s AD. On the face of it, I'll show you a little bit of both of these scripts here. But let's just consider the dates, right? If we were going to say that one of these scripts was the ancestor of the other, it would be much more reasonable to guess that the older script was the source of the younger one. And we have Elder Futhark runes in Northern Europe going back to potentially the first millennium BC, whereas we don't have Orkhon script, Turkic runes from that early. We have it from many centuries later. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't, some treasure trove of Orkhon script texts, inscriptions waiting to be discovered that are 700, 800 years earlier, but we can't assume that. And, I don't think that in many other fields of endeavor, people would consider it very fair to expect that, something attested 700, 800 years later was the earlier system. But neither one needs to be a source of the other, right? It is perfectly possible for people to start writing in scripts that kind of have some mild, and it really is very mild, aesthetic similarities, independently of one another, right? There's no real reason to assume that people speaking, Proto-Germanic, we're talking to people speaking, Proto-Turkic? The space between the area where the Yenisei area where most of the Orkhon inscriptions are found and say the Scandinavian Peninsula is about as big, maybe a little bit bigger than the space between the Scandinavian Peninsula and Newfoundland, where the Vikings went at the very edge of their explorations of the New World. So it's not very likely there's a connection just based on the distance, and there's much nearer, closer at hand sources for the runes that early Germanic people used, right? The alphabet has some relationship to the family of alphabets ultimately derived from the Phoenician alphabet. I do not agree at all with the people who derive it directly from the Phoenician alphabet. It needs to at least be derived from something that's been through Greek mediation, potentially at least partially through Roman mediation. People disagree about exactly what the source alphabet is, but there are Mediterranean alphabets that can be its source that are a lot closer. And likewise with Orkhon script, there are Sogdian scripts that are somewhat similar and used much, much closer. So Occam's razor really says these scripts don't have anything to do with one another. But what's strange is when I say that, there are people who hear that as Orkhon sucks or something like that, right? Which is absurd. It's like saying, for some reason, it's only when human beings are involved, I think, that people really get upset about statements like this way. If I said to you, these mountains are full of wild felines like mountain lions and bobcats, and some people say even potentially a lynx here and there. And then you say, well, you didn't mention wolves. And I say, well, wolves aren't felines. And you say, why do you say wolves suck? I'm not saying that. Wolves are not what I was talking about. And, there's no reason that because these scripts don't have anything to do with each other, I'm not saying there's something wrong with Orkhon. If I were going to insult one of these scripts, I'd probably insult the one that I'm most familiar with, which is the form of runes used to write Old Norse. That's the Younger Futhark. It's an incredibly inefficient alphabet. Orkhon is pretty efficient. So there, look, I insulted, quote, my side of this. I don't have anything against Orkhon or against Turkic languages. But let's look at some of the specifics. I'll give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost and a quick word about some of my upcoming projects, and I'll come back and do that. Let me just interrupt this video for a minute to tell you about my friends and partners at Grimfrost.com. These guys have been in the business for a really long time, and they really care about getting the history right. They even get runes right, and I've done some of the runes for some of their products. If you're interested in historically authentic Viking Age products, that is the place you want to go. It's also a good place to get my books, especially if you live in Europe. I also want to update you on my books, my Wanderer's Journal, a blank journal with quotes from Havamal rendered in Younger Futhark by me, as well as in my Cowboy Havamal translation, is available for pre-order and should ship in North America by mid-April. And the second enhanced edition of my Poetic Edda translation will be available by the end of this year. It includes new poems not included in the first edition and thoroughly revised older poems. Poems are already there, and a thoroughly revised introduction, and a lot more fantastic looking art. So if you look at just the letters of Orkhon script, there are a few that look superficially similar to letters in the runic alphabet. You have a letter that looks the same but means O in, I'll say Scandinavia just as a shorthand, and B on the NSA. You have a letter that looks like this and means P on the N. I guess it's more like Yenyase, but T in Scandinavia. You have this one, which means each in Orkhon, but Z in Elder Futhark runes. You have this one that means D in Elder Futhark runes, but means Bash in Orkhon. This one, which means E in Elder Futhark runes, but means Ult in Orkhon. This one means Ya in Orkhon, but Wa in Elder Futhark. This one, which means Ba in Elder Futhark, but Uk in Orkhon. I hope you're kind of getting the trend here. They have some similar shapes, but there's only so many shapes that one can make out of this, out of the space that's available to write in, right? To a certain extent, writing systems that are aesthetically similar, and the main aesthetic similarity between these scripts is that they very prominently feature a straight up and down line. They're going to have letters that look kind of the same. And It's pretty clear that Orkhon is not derived from something in the Mediterranean family of alphabets because, or if it is, it's very, very distantly derived. I guess the Aramaic script has or the Sogdian derivative of the Aramaic script, and then this derivative of probably the Sogdian script has a really, really, really distant relationship to the Mediterranean scripts, but it's not a very close one because in scripts like Greek, Roman, Runic, the B's look kind of similar to each other. The O in runes looks like an omega. The S in runes looks kind of like a sigma. These letters look kind of similar. You would expect that if one of these writing systems was borrowed from the other writing system, that they would borrow not just letters that look the same, but that they would borrow letters that look the same and sounded kind of the same, or meant a similar sound. There are counterexamples to this out there in the world. For example, Sequoia's syllabary for writing Cherokee does use some letters that look a lot like the Roman alphabet letters for writing English. But that's, I think, a pretty rare example of a real outsider doing something really different and unique for writing his language, and consciously, to some extent, probably modeling some of those letters on the ones used to write English, but using them in a completely different way, using them as a syllabary. By the way, I have an interview from a couple years ago about Cherokee that's pretty interesting for learning more about these questions. So it's like pyramids. There's pyramids in Mexico, right? Chichen Itza. There's pyramids in Egypt, but they're separated by thousands of years, and there's no reason to think that you couldn't build a pyramid without having seen a pyramid in Egypt. I think that human beings are capable of coming up with similar things in different places and different times. So Orkhon script is a really, really interesting early window into early Turkic languages, right? A lot of times the people speaking these languages are being written about from the outside, whether by Chinese or Persian or Arabic writing people, even Greek writing people, of course, once they begin to come into what today is called Turkey after Turkic-speaking people. So it's just, in a way, a lot like the runes used in Northern Europe. It's a way for us to get a little bit of writing from the horse's mouth, as it were, rather than just from outsiders. And the script is intelligently designed, right? You sometimes have different consonant shapes for that consonant used before a front vowel versus that consonant used before a back vowel. That's really pretty interesting, right? And of course, I think speaks a little bit to the structure of Turkic, where you have a little bit of that vowel harmony, where that kind of distinction might make a little bit more sense to visually flag. Orkhon actually works pretty well from what I can see. I'm a long way from an expert on Turkish or any other Turkic languages, but it seems to represent its sound system pretty well. Elder Futhark also represents the sound system of Proto-Germanic pretty well. Younger Futhark does not represent the sound system of Old Norse well. Why that is another question. But like I said, it's two scripts, interesting, aesthetically, like at first glance, a little bit similar, but then once you see that the letters mean completely different things, even when they look the same, you realize there's not a historical connection here. Occam's razor tells us that there couldn't possibly be, not with so many other candidate scripts as the source of each one of them. But Orkhon is fascinating on its own. Somehow someone will still make this into me hating Turkic or something, which I have no idea why I would. But, it is fine that people come up with their own ideas and don't base them on something else. Or rather, that they don't base them on the particular thing that we think is cool, right? I can say that, some other alphabet in the world, the Georgian script looks really cool to me, right? European Georgia. It does not mean that I have to say that it comes from runes, right? It's derived from, it has its own history. Things can have their own history. All right, anyway, thanks Patreon. Thanks everybody out there buying my books, watching out for the second edition of the Poetic Edda, revised and enhanced with a lot more art, some new translations that weren't in the original, and some significantly revised translations and introduction. So it's a better book, and I was happy with the book to start with, but I'm much happier with the second edition, which will be available toward the end of this year. And watch out for the Wanderer's Journal, available this month or next month already on Amazon, available for pre-order anyway. Well, from truly breathtakingly beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best. I'm going to ambush you and make that like the Easter egg at the end of the video.
I love it.
That's so beautiful.